So today, we're going to look at the mind-brain identity theory. We're moving on from behaviorism. We'll go over the theory in general. We'll look at Jack Smart's arguments for the identity theory, and then we'll look at some challenges. And we've really got a lot to cover today because the challenges are, in fact, some of the most challenging things to understand today. And so we'll just move straight ahead. So these are the four views that we're going to be looking at, broadly speaking, and we're moving on today to the mind-brain identity theory. Simply put, if you ask the sort of question that we started out with, what sort of thing is a mind, the answer here might be characterized or perhaps caricatured as you're nothing but a pack of neurons, okay? You're nothing but a pack of neurons. Might be surprising to you to find that out, but that's what essentially the mind-brain identity theory is saying. That you're identical to that thing over there, a brain. So whereas dualists said that the answer to what sort of thing is a mind is that it's a non-physical substance that's separate from the body, somehow interacts with it, and we saw the problems with how it might interact. The behaviorists said it's a bad question, don't even ask that question. There's really no such thing as a mind, there's just mentalistic language that is a misleading shortcut, and we should translate out all that and put it in terms of behavioral dispositions. And we saw that both theories have their problems, although none of the problems we went over are necessarily decisive, they certainly weigh against the views. So I kind of went over this a lot with people in the tutorials last week, at least at the end. The one thing that seems good about behaviorism in comparison to dualism is its commitment to physicalism. Its commitment to trying to make the investigation of the mind something that is scientifically appropriate, that we've got a methodology, and that it's doable at all, in fact, okay? Whereas for a dualist, it seems like there's no way to scientifically investigate the mind. So if we could show that the mind is part and parcel of the rest of the known universe, that would be a nice result. And maybe just what the behaviorists had wrong was the thing, or the sort of thing that they thought we should investigate instead of just introspecting on our mental states from the inside. They said we should look at behavior. Maybe they were wrong about that, and maybe what we should look at instead is the brain. Because there is a physical object in the universe that we know at least something about, maybe not quite a lot, as I've put here. There's a remarkable amount that we don't know yet, but we know something about the brain, and the brain seems to have a lot to do with the mind. I fall off my bicycle, I bang my head, I get a concussion, and I feel kind of dazed and confused. I have one too many beers, and I feel too drunk, or whatever it is. So there's lots of things that we can do to our brain, and they seem to affect our mind, right? So the brain certainly seems to have something to do with the mind. So maybe that's a point of departure, and we should start investigating that instead of behavior, as the behaviorists said. Okay, so the claim here, we'll go over this in much more detail now in a moment, but the claim is that the mind is the same thing as the brain. That's why it's called identity theory. They're identical. So whereas behaviorism said that to be in a mental state really should just be translated, it's a semantic thesis, remember. It should be translated to say that you're disposed to behave in certain ways. By contrast, the identity theory will say that to be in a mental state is just to be in some neurophysiological state, roughly speaking. Now, the important thing to note here is this is a hypothesis. Nobody yet knows all of the correlations between mental states and particular types of neurophysiological states, but the identity theorist hopes that these correlations will eventually be established and that their hypothesis will be confirmed. Science will discover all these correlations. Okay, so compare a behaviorist claim and an identity theorist claim. So a behaviorist will say pain is the disposition to behave in such and such a way. Okay, wince or say ouch or whatever it is. Some kind of behavior, overt behavior. The identity theorist will say that pain is, say, the firing of C fibers in the brain. Now, if you go to your friend who's doing neuroscience and say, oh, I was studying philosophy and I heard about C fibers, what are they? your friend will say, I don't know what you're talking about, C fibers? So C fibers is just a philosophical term of art here, meant to pick out, it's like a variable saying X or something, okay? It's just meant to pick out whatever it turns out to be the correct neurophysiological state for pain, say, or for feeling happy, or whatever it is, whatever mental state you're in. So pain here, the claim will be the firing of C fibers, where C fibers is just a variable picking out whatever the correct correlated neurophysiological state will eventually be discovered to be. Now, on the surface, these kinds of claims might look really similar. We're saying pain is blah, and then the identity theorist is also saying pain is blah, something else, okay? But they only look similar until we start to look at how people can use is, so the meaning of is. There's a number of ways. I'm just going to cover 3 to give you a flavor. A number of ways that people use is. So you might have a puppy dog, Wesley. You might say, Wesley is sad, okay? So here you're attributing some characteristic, some property or whatever to something. The is of predication. By contrast, you might say a cloud is a collection of water droplets suspended in the atmosphere. So you're not using the is of predication here. You're not saying that cloud is large in the same way that you would say Wesley is sad. You're using the is of composition. You're saying what clouds are actually made up of, what they're composed of, okay? What clouds actually are. You can also use is in another way, the is of definition. You say a bachelor is an unmarried man of marriageable age. And there, it's not like saying that a cloud is a collection of water droplets, etc. You're not saying what bachelors are made up out of, because then you'd have to start talking about arms and legs and or even at a finer grain of detail, bits of flesh and so on, blood, whatever, okay? But that's not what you're doing. You're giving a definition, okay? You're saying what the word or the concept means. You're giving an analysis of the concept, and it's an analytic claim, as philosophers will call it. It's something that you can just sort of think about and establish from the armchair. Just sitting here in the classroom, we can think about what the definition of something like a bachelor would be. But if we want to find out what clouds are, we can't do that sitting in here. We have to go out, maybe fly in an airplane and go up and actually take a bit of a cloud and see what's it made out of. And you find, oh, water droplets, fine. It's a different kind of thing. Okay, so when a logical behaviorist says pain is the disposition to say ouch, move away from the stimulus, etc., they're using the is of definition. Remember, it's a semantic thesis. They're telling us what the word pain really means. What we really mean when we say we're in pain is just that we're disposed to say ouch, etc. Now, when the identity theorists, including Place here, who's an Australian philosopher, and we'll see that Jack Smart also was an Australian philosopher. I should mention that Australia, for its relatively small population, has produced quite a number of the most outstanding philosophers of the 20th century. So there's something in the air in Australia, or the water, or something, that makes people into good philosophers. In any case, an identity theorist like Place would say that pain is the firing of C fibers in the brain. Here, they're using the is of composition. They're not defining what pain means as a semantic thesis. They're making an empirical conjecture, and in fact, they're hoping it'll be confirmed as an identity claim, that that's just what pain is made out of, in the same way that clouds are made out of water droplets. Now, when we're using is in these different ways, we're actually making identity claims of various kinds. Now, some of you will remember from taking the intro unit with me that we talked about qualitative and quantitative identity. So roughly speaking here, we were using it in different contexts, talking about personal identity before. But here, let's just say qualitative identity is when things share similar properties. So we can say that these guys are qualitatively identical today. They're sharing some similar properties. They're wearing the same clothes with stripes on, etc. Of course, when it comes to numerical or strict identity, which is the kind of identity we're going to have in mind today and that the identity theorist has in mind, we mean the relation of identity, remember, is odd. It's a relation that everything only bears to itself. So to be numerically identical is just to be one and the same thing. So in this sense, obviously, these guys are not numerically identical. I mean, you look at them and you see 2, right? So it's not 1. In order to be numerically identical, there would just have to be one thing. But we can say that Arnie here is identical to himself, by all means, in the numerical or strict identity sense. Now, especially when it comes to identity at a time, so what philosophers call synchronic identity as opposed to diachronic identity, which is across time, what makes you the same person as you were when you were a baby, etc. Qualitative identity will be required for numerical identity. Now, here's just technical definitions that I've used before in my intro unit. But look, numerical identity, you're numerically identical to yourself. X and Y are numerically identical if and only if, that's not a typo, X and Y are one thing rather than 2. Things are qualitatively identical, now not just in sharing some similar properties, but absolutely qualitatively identical if and only if for some set of non-relational properties of X, Y has all and only those properties as well. Remember, non-relational properties are just properties like being 6 foot tall, as opposed to being maybe the tallest person in the room. That's a relational property. You might be the tallest person in the room, but then I bring in the Australian basketball team and you're not the tallest person in the room anymore. So that kind of property depends on other things. It's a relational property. A non-relational property, you don't change from being 6 foot tall when I bring in all the basketball players in the world in here, okay? That's a non-relational property. Okay, so the identity theorist's claim is going to be that mental states and processes are strictly or numerically identical to brain states and processes. And just remember and keep in the back of your mind Leibniz's law here for testing for identity. We've gone over this a few times. The indiscernibility of identicals and the identity of indiscernibles. Okay. So this is the kind of identity we're going to have in mind, strict numerical identity. They are the one thing. Okay, now there are different kinds of identity statements. So some are conceptual, or what I called a moment ago, analytic truths. And here we're using the is of definition. So we define what a bachelor is, we define what a triangle is, and so on. It's a semantic claim, it's the is of definition, but it's still an identity claim. Now, other kinds of identity claims, the ones we're going to be interested in, are empirical discoveries. The is of composition. So we might go out and do a bit of investigation, private investigation, right? And we find out sneakily that, in fact, Superman is Clark Kent. They're not two people, they're actually just the same person. Okay, they're identical. So those are just two names for the same thing, same person. Similarly, lightning is identical to atmospheric discharge of electricity, or water is identical to H2O. That's just what water is, okay? We're not defining the meaning of the water, of the term water. So the ancient Greeks might have used the term water or a similar term. They had the concept, but they thought it was a fundamental element, a basic element. Turns out that it's actually composed of more basic things. Now the question here is whether a claim about mental states being identical to brain states, like pain is identical to C fibers firing, is going to be the same sort of empirical claim about identity, one that we could confirm in the same way that we can confirm that water is made out of H2O. So that's the question on the table. Now this strategy has an excellent scientific heritage. So claims like lightning is an atmospheric discharge of electricity and so on, people have been successful in using this strategy. So in each case, basically what science has found out is that the former thing, say lightning or heat, in the example I've used here, temperature say, is nothing more than the latter thing, okay? So lightning is nothing more than an atmospheric discharge of electricity. So we've just got two words for the same thing. We're not picking out two different things in the world. So there's a general strategy here. What we do is we discover some systematic correlation say between lightning, our uses of the term lightning, and certain kinds of electrical discharges. Then we consider various possibilities. Okay? So we could ask, well, are two different properties instantiated when we have this correlation? And if that's right, then we have to ask a more basic question. Do they have a common cause? Is that what makes them correlate all the time? Are they both caused by the same thing? Or is there some natural law connecting them? Or another possibility we might consider is that, in fact, no, there are not two properties instantiated here. There's just one. Okay? And in general, people would prefer to make this sort of claim in science because it's simpler, and as we'll see in a moment, the claim is that in virtue of being simpler, it's better, just to say that, to make the claim, the identity claim, that only one and the same property is being instantiated here. So when it comes to the mind, there's all kinds of work on the neural correlates of consciousness. So people correlating mental state claims, reports, with neural activity. So there's a lot of work on this, correlating between people who are saying, oh, I see red, and what's going on in the brain, and so on. So you employ the same strategy here. You discover these systematic correlations between mind and brain, mental state claims and brain states, M and B here. And then you consider the same possibilities. Are there two properties? Well, if so, then is there some common cause? At the very beginning, I mentioned a view called neutral monism. As a form of monism, it's not dualism, but it says that mental states and brain states, or physical states of some kind, are very different. But really, the world is only made out of one thing. But it's made out of something that we don't know. It's neutral, a common cause for both of those things. But that's a mysterious claim. We want naturally to start investigating that thing then, but we don't know how to get to it. Or we might posit some natural law connecting mental states and brain states. That is what Kim was suggesting that Descartes should do in the pairing problem. Hey, give us some mental coordinate system that will allow us to pair mental causes with physical states in our physical coordinate system, right? But that's really difficult to figure out how to do. And so the identity theorist's claim is, look, let's just jump to trying to make an identity claim here. We've got these really nice correlations. It's worked before with lightning, with water, etc. Let's try it here. Infer the best possibility, and in this case, they're going to claim that it's the identity claim that will explain everything that we want to explain here. Okay, so that's just an overview of what the mind-brain identity theorist is committed to. So let's see Smart's arguments for the thesis. So here's Smart. He's looking at a red apple, okay? And he's having a kind of an experience that we're all having right now when we look at that image of a red apple. Kind of an experience of reddishness is there, or I'm experiencing reddishness, okay? He talks about an after image and so on, but we're just going to focus on this. Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry, I thought your hand was up. So we might say, I'm having an RA, a red apple experience, a reddishness experience. We'll call it an RA experience. Now, Smart asks, what are we saying when we say something like this? What kind of utterance is this? Is it a report of something, and if so, what? Well, various things. He considers options. Maybe it's not really a report, but just what he calls an expressive statement. So basically, it's a sophisticated sort of behavior. Maybe it's something that the behaviorist would be interested in. It's just behavior because I'm saying stuff and moving my mouth. That's behavior, right? So it's just some kind of expressive statement. It's not a report of anything because we don't want to appeal to mental states if we're behaviorists. So that's the kind of thing the behaviorist might say. Or it might be a report of some kind of irreducible psychical something, as he puts it, in some places. So there, it's the kind of thing maybe that Descartes is interested in. Something just, it's irreducible to physical stuff. It's just an irreducible mental thing, an experience, phenomenal state, as some people will call it. Or it might be a report of something that is, in fact, as it turns out, a brain state. Now, that's not a mere correlation. I mean, even Descartes might have a correlation between mental states and brain states, and somehow the mental states are causing the brain states to do things. But the claim here is not that that's all that's going on. It's that whatever it is we're reporting, this experience of reddishness, is nothing over and above the brain state or brain process that we might identify or pick out. Okay, now, why? I mean, look, he's got a reason for this. The argument is kind of simple, but also maybe difficult to appreciate. He says, why do I wish to do this? Identify sensations or phenomenal experiences like this of reddishness with brain's processes. He says, mainly because of Occam's razor. We'll talk about Occam in a moment. There does seem to be, he says, so far as science is concerned, nothing in the world but increasingly complex arrangements of physical constituents, all except for one place, okay? The mind, consciousness. Sensations, states of consciousness, he admits, do seem to be the one sort of thing left outside the physicalist picture. That's why we've got the mind-body problem. And for various reasons, he says, I just can't believe that this could be so. That everything else is explicable in terms of physics, except the occurrence of sensations like seeing reddishness, seems to me frankly unbelievable. Okay, interesting. So poor old Jack here is having a hard time appreciating. He says, it's quite frankly unbelievable. I mean, is that sort of thing a good argument just by itself? So I'm a flat earther, right? I believe that the earth is flat. I don't, of course, but there's a guy in the US right now who wants to fly into space in a rocket that he's making himself in order to prove to himself that the earth is flat. He says he's going to go into orbit. Orbit? Does he not understand the word orbit, right? You have to orbit around something. I mean, it's not clear to me how you can even get into space without first assuming that the Earth is a globe so that you know what to do, right? With the physics even. In any case, imagine I'm a guy like him, right? And I say, quite frankly, I find it unbelievable that the Earth could be round or a globe. Quite frankly, unbelievable. I have a hard time, right? Done. That's my argument. Good? Do you go, oh, wow, so the Earth is flat, right? A deductive argument. If you believe the premises, you must believe the conclusion. I'm forcing you to believe this thing. No, you don't believe me. You say, oh, God, that guy is just like, he doesn't want to take the evidence into account or something. So by itself, finding something quite frankly unbelievable is not really a good argument. But that's not quite what Smart is doing here, okay? He's appealing to Occam's razor. Now, this is a general principle that entities should not be multiplied beyond what we need to explain something, and what can be done, or let's say explained, with fewer assumptions should not be done with more. So I show you a box. It's got a light bulb on top. It's got a switch on the side. We don't know what's inside, okay? And I say, let's generate some hypotheses for what happens. I click the switch and the light bulb comes on. One hypothesis is there's a simple electrical circuit connecting the switch and the light bulb, and when I press the switch, then that circuit gets connected and the light comes on. But we could give all kinds of other hypotheses. We could say, well, the switch sends a radio signal to my friend in the next building, and then he looks at that, and then he sends a signal back, which turns the light on, right? Or we could say something like Descartes, that in fact there's an immaterial mind floating somewhere nearby in the box, and when I press the switch, it sends a signal to the mind, and then the mind kind of does something for a while, and then it sends a signal to the light, and it comes on. We could generate all kinds of crazy hypotheses, right? But the simplest one is just the first one. And generally, we prefer that. We can explain what is occurring, or at least as a hypothesis, is occurring in the box with fewer entities. Let's not appeal to radios or immaterial souls or something. And with fewer assumptions, then that's just better, okay? So that's the claim here. Now, what kind of simplicity has Smart got in mind? Ontological, conceptual or explanatory here? Think about the identity claim, what he's saying. Mental states just are brain states. Anyone? Anyone?
Explanatory.
Which?
Explanatory.
Explanatory. Yeah, there is an explanatory thing going on here, but it's important that we see that the most fundamental thing going on here is an ontological claim. He's trying to say what mental states actually are fundamentally made out of. What's their nature? Now, you're right that there's an explanatory thesis going on here as well, and an explanatory simplicity, but it's going to be in virtue of that ontological simplicity, okay? The explanation will also be simpler. Okay, so you're right that there is an explanatory simplicity going on here, but more fundamentally than that, the claim is an actual ontological claim about what things are made up out of. Okay. So the claim here is that types of mental states and processes are in fact identical to types of brain states and processes. And we'll remember your types and tokens and just bear this in mind, because when we come back next week to look at functionalism, we'll see a problem with this type claim. But the claim is that pain is a type of mental state, and it's identical to a particular type of brain state. It's not that when I have pain, I'm in brain state C process fibers firing and the neuron B fibers firing or something. It's that whenever anything is in pain, it's having C fibers firing. Okay? So it's a type claim. Now, the explanatory simplicity that does come from the ontological simplicity, basically correlations are going to always require explanations of some kind. Mind-brain correlations, it seems, can't be derived from some more fundamental laws, which was one of the options, remember. M experiences, so mental experiences like seeing redishness or something. Smart calls these nomological danglers, right? They're nomological danglers. Nomological just means in reference to laws of nature, like of physics or something. They're nomological danglers because we would have maybe laws of neuroscience that explain neural behavior or occurrences, but here we wouldn't have any similar laws to explain the mental states, okay? So the mental states would be nomological danglers because there would be no laws explaining them. There'd only be laws explaining what they correlate with, which seems weird. It'd be the only place in the universe where we would have something like this, right? Where we just have this thing that doesn't have laws explaining it. It'd be a nomological dangler. Now, the nice thing about identity statements is that they don't require explanations in this way, and they avoid introducing nomological danglers. Why? Well, if the mental states, and we're worried, oh, what laws would explain them? Well, if they're identical, if they just are brain states, then we already have laws that explain them. The laws of neuroscience. Lovely. No nomological danglers. So that's the key move that he's trying to make here, to avoid having these nomological danglers. Now, there's a bit of a worry here. I'm just mentioning it. Kim brings this thing up here that even if we avoid that possibility of nomological danglers, we still seem to have these irreducible postulates about the world. But we won't worry about that for too much now, because I want to get on to other stuff. Okay, so this is not a claim about conceptual simplicity. It's not a claim like the behaviorists might make about semantics, that an RA, a red apple experience, means the same thing as brain process X, or could be translated into statements like that. It's not that those kinds of experiences have the same claims about them, have the same sort of logic as claims about brain states. It's also not an epistemological point. It's not that in reporting the mere fact that I'm having a red apple experience, I know somehow that I'm reporting about a brain state. I might tell you, like, Clark Kent spilled coffee in the coffee room in the office today, and Clark Kent is really annoying, right? I don't know that I'm making claims about Superman being annoying, okay, but in fact I am, right? So similarly here, we don't have to know that we're making claims about brain states just when we're saying things about having certain experiences. Now this is important because identity statements are supposed to be surprising in a certain way. Okay? We discover, oh my God, water, it's actually H2O. Surprising in some way. We can't discover that just from sitting in our armchair. Okay, now, That's the Smart's argument for the theory. Occam's razor, and then make the move to identity, an identity claim.